Good evening, everyone. It's being taped, so please. Tonight we're going to, in honor of Tisha, the night and the day that we mourn the destruction of the temple, let me give you a history. This is a fascinating chapter. Sadly, it is a very sad chapter in Jewish history, one of the saddest chapters of Jewish history. As you will see soon, nothing compares to it. Some even say the Holocaust that happened in Europe doesn't compare to it, because if you're talking about in terms of proportion, a greater disaster took place during the destruction of the Second Temple than even the disaster that happened in 1940 to 1945 in Europe. But before I get to that, let me spend a few minutes on giving you a general overview of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple. We know that God gave the Jewish people a mitzvah while they were still in the desert to build a Beis Hamikdash, to build a temple. In the desert, they built, under Moses' direction, they built a portable temple, but it used the it served the function of the meeting place between God and the Jewish people. As you know, they built the Mishkan. The Mishkan stood for 40 years in the desert, and they moved with them. Wherever they went in the desert, they moved it. It was a portable temple. Once they got to Israel under the leadership of Joshua, they built the Mishkan, they set up the Mishkan in a place called Gilgal. Gilgal is not far from Jericho, because they crossed the Jordan near Jericho, so naturally that's very near to that place. They set up the tabernacle, and that was in Gilgal during the 14 years that the Jewish people fought the wars and conquered the land of Israel and divided the land of Israel. And we know there was 7 years of the war and 7 years of division. So the portable temple lasted for 54 years. Once they finished conquering the land and divided it amongst the Jewish people, everyone was situated in their lot, in their piece of land of Israel that they inherited. So they finally built a more permanent temple in a place called Shiloh. Shiloh is a city in the Shomron Hills, which is Samaria. Today they call it the West Bank. But then it was Samaria, and it was somewhere between Jerusalem and Shechem. Nablus. That temple was made out of stone. And that lasted for 369 years. Throughout the whole era of the judges. Some of the judges, you'll know, Samson was a judge. The great mighty Samson. Yiftach, and others, great Devorah, famous prophetess Devorah. These were all the judges. The judges lasted 300 years, and after 369 years, by the time of the last judge, a man by the name of Eli, that this temple in Shiloh was destroyed. Once that was destroyed, they had to build a new one. It was destroyed, I believe, by the Philistines. The new one was built. I may be wrong about that. It may not have been the Philistines that destroyed it, but it was destroyed. Once that was destroyed, they built another 2 temples in 2 places called Nov and Givon. And the temples in each of these places lasted a total of 57 years. So now we have 40 years in the desert, 14 years is 54, 369, who's going to math it? 423, and 57 is 480. Correct? 480 years. If you look in the prophets, in the book of Malachim and Kings, it says that 480 years after they left Egypt, finally Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. The final temple, the first Beis Hamikdash on the Mount Moriah, was built 480 years after they left Egypt, and that lasted for 410 years. It was a beautiful temple. He did not spare any. I mean, he spent, money was no object whatsoever. And he built the temple. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jews were driven into exile for 70 years into Babel, into Babylonia. After 70 years, Ezra the prophet, or as he's known, Ezra the scribe, the last of the prophets, convinced 16,000 Jews, Babylonian Jews, to come with him to Israel to build the second temple. And he got permission from the Persian emperor. And they came to Israel with very little means. The Jews were downtrodden in Israel. They had no money. So they built a very basic second temple. And it was made of wood. It wasn't very fancy. And the Tanakh said that there were some people that still remember the first temple. They were old. And they cried comparing the old one with the new one. That's how less of a, it wasn't magnificent like the first one. But it was a temple, and it was back in Jerusalem. They started the second Commonwealth. The second temple lasted a total of 420 years. How much is 480? 410 and 420? It's 830, 910, 1310 years. Amongst its history of the Jewish people, we had a temple in some form for 1310 years. So that's just an overview, and now we are now in exile. The temple was destroyed in the year 69, and we still find ourselves in that. We were driven into exile. It was destroyed by the Romans, as you will soon see, and we still await the rebuilding of the third Beis Hamikdash, which will be built. This will be built by God Himself, and it will last forever. And that will happen when Mashiach comes. Tonight I want to tell you the story of the destruction of the second temple. The truth is, it's a long story, and to tell you the story in all its details the way it should be told, we will be here till 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'm going to abbreviate it. I'm going to give you the general overview, and I'm afraid I won't do it in an hour either, but I'll try my best. The Talmud tells us, the rabbis tell us that the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, because of senseless hatred. The Jewish people were torn apart. And the truth of the matter is, today we bemoan the fact that there's so many different factions. The Jewish people, there's no unity, and we're not getting along. Let me tell you this. All the quarrels, remind yourself in your life, the worst era, the worst period of time of Jewish infighting, it's kindergarten compared to what was going on during the last 50 years or 100 years of the Second Temple. Kindergarten. That means nothing compared. I mean, that was, what was going on then was killings. Informing to the authorities. I mean, you can't make it up. That's how bad it was. And indeed, when that happens, it's just downhill from there. If Jews are so torn apart, the rest, the goyim, the anti-Jews, step right in and come. They come to pick up the pieces, as they say. And it's no wonder that we imploded from within. The Romans didn't even have to do much. We did it for them. The story begins 100 years before the destruction itself, or maybe more, but generally speaking. The story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah was about 165 years before the temple was destroyed. The The story of Hanukkah is the story of the Greeks that fought the Jewish people, and then the kingdom of Israel was under the family known as the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, Yehuda, and all that family. There were tremendous struggles in the Hashmonaim family after Hanukkah. There was infighting. There was a king and he had 2 children. They fought for the crown. They fought for the throne, and there was even killings. They would assassinate each other, poison each other, things that you can't imagine. And the Romans began to take over the world. About 120 years or 150 years before the Common Era, before the destruction of the temple. I'm sorry. And again, the destruction happened in 69. And the Romans set their eyes on the land of Israel. With the Hashmonaim becoming so divided, and not only divided but corrupt, completely corrupt, where at that time there was a division between the spiritual leadership of the Jewish people, that were the priest, the high priest, and the Kohanim in the temple, and the political leadership of the Jewish people, which were the Hashmonaim, the kings, and so on and so forth. Now, that this came at this time, was introduced into the Jewish people a belief system called the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, as we call them in English. The Sadducees, just to be brief, are people that do not believe in the oral Torah, in the rabbinic Judaism. They only believe in the Bible. What the Torah says in the Bible is what we believe. The rest we don't believe. The oral tradition they didn't believe. And they became very powerful amongst the Jewish people in the political leadership, in the spiritual leadership, believe it or not. They bought the way into the temple. They bought the position of the high priest. When that happens, when the Tzedukim that don't even believe in Judaism become the high priest, you can imagine what kind of time we're talking about. The Romans, as I mentioned, began to set sights on the land of Israel, and they began to install, with such a breakup within the Jewish people and the alliances. It's a long story, you have to understand it, Pompey and this one and that way. There's a lot of history here, but I want to get quickly to the actual war that was the 9-year war that destroyed the temple. But the Romans were installed during that 100 years, starting from Herod the Great. During 100 years before the temple was Herod, and he was a ruthless man. He was installed by the Romans, and he was a Jew, and they weren't sure if he's a Jew. The Jews didn't really consider him Jewish, and he knew that, and he killed all the rabbis, he killed everyone. Believe it or not, this Herod had remorse that he killed all the rabbis. He wasn't happy about it. And there was a man in his time, one of the great sages, his name was Bava ben Buta. He's quoted in the Talmud. This Herod poked out his eyes, he blinded him. But Bava was a very good man, and he realized that he overdid it with the rabbis and him. So he asked him to give him to chart out for him a way back to God, to make up for what he did. So the advice that he was given was to redo the temple, to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. That second temple that was dilapidated, that didn't look good, that was not. Now Herod was a man that was larger than life. Everything he did, you go in Israel today, there's so many ruins, the ancient ruins are from Herod's time. You have his palace on the Masada. He built up Masada. He has his palace there. He has another palace. He has these ruins from in ancient cities. I mean, whatever he did grandiose. And when he set out to build the temple, he also decided he was going to do this in a larger-than-life, a grandiose way. And money, again, wasn't an object. He went even further than Solomon. He built the temple to the point where the Talmud says whoever didn't see his house, that building that he built, the temple, has never seen a beautiful building in their life. That's how beautiful. I mean, he brought in stone and things from Italy and from all over the world. He built on the top, on the roof of the temple, such an apparatus that it was the way he put the stones together. At sunrise, when the sun came up on the eastern horizon, and when it shined on the stones, it looked like an ocean, it looked like a river. The water was moving. It looked like everything was 3D. I mean, the thing was just magnificent. So here's a man that killed all the sages, and he goes and builds a temple for the Jewish people that is nicer than any other temple we ever had. But so goes history. That's God's sense of humor, if you want to call it a sense of humor. Little by little, the Jewish position of the leadership was eroding. The Romans were becoming more powerful, and the Jews were like pawns in their hands. And there were different factions within the Jewish people that began to say this is not acceptable anymore, and which led to the 9-year war starting in the year 66. Or 63, 63. I'm going to tell you what the different factions were first, so you understand. First were there's 4 different groups that were tugging at each other, so to say, within the Jewish people. First you had the Sikrikun. The Sikrikun is mentioned in the Talmud. They are like, for lack of a better word, I would call them the mafia. They're like, there's no, when you need a hitman, that you call the Sikrikun. They were wild, and they were zealots. They were just, did whatever they wanted, and they hated the Romans, obviously. But they were ruthless. The Jewish mafia in Jerusalem. Another group was the Kanoim, the Zealots. The Zealots were the people that believed that we have to fight the Romans till the last drop of blood. This is our temple, it's our land, and we're going to fight them to the last drop of blood. Then there was the third group, the Sadducees. The Sadducees, they were in charge of the temple in a way, and they were in charge of the kingdom. They were the pawns of the Romans, but the Sadducees were of the opinion that there's not much you can do. Succumb, give it up, and so on. In fact, there was more than that. The Sadducees, in a way, actually became, in a way, traitors. They were more on the side of the Romans than on the side of the Jews, if you know what I mean. And then there were the Perushim, the rabbis, the sages. The loyal Jews. And the rabbis were of the opinion that this war, the Jews cannot win against the Romans. The Romans are just much, much too strong for us. And it's better to not fight. Work out a deal with the Romans. Don't fight them. And let's see what happens. And make the best of the situation. Don't fight a losing battle. Now, these battles that I mentioned before, the Kanoim, the Zealots, the Sikrikun, they were at each other. There was no mercy. And this ultimately destroyed the temple, and you had so much disunity among the Jewish people, as I mentioned before. I want to tell you who led the war. The leaders of the war, that finally, when they decided in the year 63 to fight the Romans, you had a number of leaders in the army. One of them was a 9-year war, by the way. This is not something that happened in a month, right? And then you have the UN, they make a ceasefire and it's over. This was a 9-year war that was bloody. A couple of million people died. The population of the Jewish people at this time is 4 million. I'm sorry, 100 years before the temple, there were 4 million Jews in Israel. Some counts say that by the time the temple was destroyed, there were 10 million Jews living in Israel. The population growth in that 100 years was enormous. And there's a whole history behind that because of conversion. A lot of Romans converted. It was that 100 years where there was tremendous numbers of converts to the Jewish people. So the Jewish numbers reached 10 million according to some counts. Half a large majority, a big number were wiped out. Now, one of the leaders of the war, and they go through a few of the leaders so you get a picture where they were and how they fought. The Jewish leaders one of them was a man by the name of Yochanan Gush Chalav. Yochanan Gush Chalav was in the Galilee, the upper Galilee, and he led, he was from the Kanoim, the Zealots, and he fought, he gathered around him an army, a militia up in the north, and he was a fierce warrior, very strong, a tremendous strategist, and so on and so forth. And he conquered up in the north many of the Roman cities. By that time, Rome was all over already. They were in Caesarea, they were all over in the north of Israel and the south. And they had fortified cities. He conquered most of those cities and pushed them towards the coastline. So the Romans were now in Caesarea, in what's called today in Hebrew, Caesarea. He had a large army with him, thousands of troops, and he was successful. He was closing in on the Romans in the north. Another man, a leader of another part of the army, was a man by the name of Shimon Bar Giori. He was the head of the Sikrikum, this first group that we mentioned before. A third individual who was also from the Zealots, from the Kanoim, was a man by the name of Elazar ben Shimon. And the fourth was Elazar ben Yoir. You remember the story of Masada. Most of you have been to Israel, you probably climbed Masada. And over there was the story of Elazar ben Yair, that was the last stand against the Romans, and they all committed suicide, which we'll talk about soon as we get there. In addition to these armies, there was the official army of the Jewish people, under the king of the time, which was Agrippa II. He was the king of the Jewish people of Judah, and he had his own army. And he appointed a man by the name of Yosef ben Matisyahu the Kohen. He's a very famous individual. Most people know him for his Roman name, none other than Josephus. Everyone knows Josephus, right? Josephus wrote books. There's a whole debate about Josephus, if he's loyal, if he was a traitor, or if he was a hero, and so on, which we'll talk about a little later when we talk about the actual war, where he fits in and what he did and why he's considered by some a traitor and by others, by himself, a hero. In addition, you had the high priest in Jerusalem at the time. There were actually two high priests. They rotated, and they were from the Tzedukim, from the Sadducees, the ones that didn't even believe in the oral tradition. Now, let me talk a few minutes about the rabbi's position. At this time, I mentioned to you there were two forms of leadership in Israel. One was of the political leadership, and then there was the religious leadership. The religious leadership were by the great rabbis of the Sanhedrin. And the great rabbis, this great head of the Sanhedrin at this time, right before the destruction of the temple, was a man by the name of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was a descendant of Hillel, the great Hillel, the famous sage Hillel. And this was before the war. When he died, his son Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Gamliel, took over the position of the head of the Sanhedrin, and he was just before the destruction of the temple. Together with him, now the truth is that he himself tried to save the situation, to meddle, to explain to the zealots, and to convince them, to knock some sense into their head that you're not going to be able to stand up to Rome, you're going to lose the war. But the Kanoim would want no part of that. They wouldn't hear what he's saying. We're going to fight. We're not suckers. We're not this. We're not weak. We're not weaklings. We're going to fight the Romans. This is our land, our temple. We're going to protect it. Together with Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was the youngest of the disciples of Hillel. He was known as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is going to become the hero of this era. Turns out that he was, with his vision, was able to save the Jewish people during this time, as you will see soon. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel himself hid during this time, because he knew that if the Romans win, and their custom was that when they won, they took all the leaders of the opposing sides and had them assassinated. So he was afraid that they would assassinate him, so he went into hiding, leaving the leadership to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Turns out that during the war, he passed away. The war itself began in the Galil, in the upper Galil, in the year 64. For the first 2 years of the war, the Jews had tremendous successes. They destroyed Roman city after Roman city, and as I mentioned, Yochanan Gush Chalav was up in the north together with Josephus. Josephus was also up in the north. He was appointed the leader of the legions by the king of Judah, by Agrippa, and they conquered the whole Galilee up till the coast, and they pretty much succeeded in getting rid of the Romans from the northern part of Israel. And the Romans were locked up now, trapped in Caesarea, which is a coastal town. I'm sure many of you went there and saw the ruins of Caesarea. In the year 66, when the Romans saw what was going on, they sent a Roman general by the name of Vespasian. You probably heard this name. Vespasian is the man that actually brings the victory to the Romans. And he came with 3 vast legions of the Roman army, and he brought his son, Titus. You all know Titus, you heard the Arch of Titus in Rome. So him and his son came, and they led the army from the year 66. When they saw the losses that they were suffering, they were sent, Vespasian and the son Titus, to turn the tide to the benefit of Rome. And they did. They changed everything. Now, Josephus was very weak. For some reason, he didn't protect the north with wisdom. And he was on the, and he ended up, believe it or not, he ended up on the Roman side. And this is where the view of him becomes, he's a traitor, he's going over to the other side. But you'll see soon that he had a whole different view of the matter. The Romans, when Vespasian came with their legions, they came with no mercy whatsoever. They came and they rampaged through city after city, killing everyone. There was no innocent civilians, there was none of that. They killed everyone. They left no one alive, without mercy, nothing. Those that were left alive with Josephus decided, his soldiers that were under him decided that they had 70 soldiers left, and instead of allowing the Romans to kill them, they decided that they're going to commit suicide. He arranged that he should be the number 70 to commit suicide, and he had all the 69 came before him. Once the 69 were all dead, then he decided that maybe it's not such a good idea to commit suicide, and he ended up, as I mentioned before, he went over to Vespasian and joined with him. Once they joined with him, it's not so simple. He didn't just join against the Jewish people. You will see soon how he explained his actions. From 66 till 70, from the year 66 till 70, he was with the Romans. And that's when he saw the whole war. He experienced it. He saw it. And that's when when he went to Rome, he wrote his books. He wrote the whole history of the Jewish people because he saw it with his own eyes. And later, after the war, he went to Rome, and he was very well respected there. He got an important position. He wrote his books, and his books are very well received. They're considered authoritative. Even in Jewish, traditional Jewish sources, he is brought down regarding the events of the war as proof. In other words, his books were seen as authoritative and true. In the year 68, Vespasian arrived in Jerusalem. He took over the whole north up till Jerusalem. He arrived in Jerusalem in the year 68. Now, Jerusalem was a tough city to conquer. It had walls around it, 2 sets of walls. And the city today, as we see, the old city of Jerusalem, is much smaller than it used to be. For example, the gate, the southern gate, is right near the wall, right? You go down 200 yards and you're by the southern gate already. And that's not correct. That's not where the city was in the times of David, for sure not. By times of David, it extended way further to conclude the whole city of David, which is further out of it. But be that as it may, the walls of Jerusalem, the people, the Jews that lived inside the city of Jerusalem, they prepared for this war, and they were able to withstand the siege of the Romans for 20 years. They had enough supplies, food, water. They stacked up the city with enough supplies for 20 years. And the fight went on. The Romans are outside the city, surrounded the city, and this is not going anywhere. It's not, there's no, they're inside, they're outside, and it's just standstill. The Zealots, what they did now is just unbelievable. They wanted the Jews to fight. So they were fighting against the rabbis. They didn't agree with the rabbis. And they wanted to not to allow a situation where 20 years we're going to be in the siege, even though they have the supplies. What did they do? They go and burn down all the supplies, all the storehouses. They burnt everything down. What were they thinking? This way the Jews will be forced to fight the Romans because they'll run out of water, they'll run out of supplies, they'll run out of grain. They must fight. They'll win the war, hopefully. This is the zealots. They acted like zealots. Thinking back today in hindsight, it's not believable that this happened. But it did. In the city itself, the zealots were in charge of the temple. They took over the temple area. The Sikrikim, which is the mafia, they were also in a certain section of the city. Agrippa, the king, had his men in a different. They all were in the whole city fighting. I mean, the Jews were fighting. Was infighting. It was the worst era of infighting of the Jewish people in the long history of the Jewish people till today. Now, naturally, with such a long siege, a couple of years, illnesses broke out. Now they destroyed all the supplies, so there was hunger and starvation. People were dying. It was a complete and utter disaster. Now, during this time, the Talmud tells us the story. I mentioned to you Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai earlier, right? What the Kanoim did, what the Zealots did, they made sure that no one went in and out of the city. They didn't let anyone leave the city, because you leave, you join, you escape, and finish. They lose men. So they locked the city from inside, no one can leave. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was inside the city. He was the leader of the Sanhedrin, the leader of the Jewish people, the spiritual leader. He realized that the Jews are losing this war. And it's going to be not just the loss of Jerusalem. They're going to kill millions of people, which they did. So he wanted to go over to the side, to outside the city, to go meet Vespasian. To go meet him. Now, what did he do? The Talmud tells us that he put himself in a coffin. He played dead. and a coffin they're going to let go out to bury. So he's in the coffin, and a few of his students are carrying him out, but the Kanoim, the Zealots, didn't really believe that he's dead. They had a suspicion that this is that. So they stabbed they stuck a knife through the coffin. In the midst of him, he survived it. And they let him out, and he came to Vespasian. And what happened at that time, Rome had at that point appointed Vespasian to be the emperor of Rome. They were very impressed with his abilities. He was a cruel man, and he killed a lot of people, which was the type of man that Rome wanted. That was the criteria you needed to become the emperor of Rome. So they sent a messenger to Israel, to the front lines in the battle of Jerusalem, to tell Vespasian that he is becoming the emperor of Rome. God had it, the divine hand in history arranged it that Rabbi Yisroel should meet Vespasian just a little bit before this messenger came from Rome to tell Vespasian that he became the new emperor. And Rabbi Yisroel told Vespasian, he bowed to him, as you do for a king, and Vespasian wanted to kill him. How do you bow not the king? And he said, yes, you are the king. You were appointed to be the king of Rome. And he didn't believe it. He thought that was a stab in the back of the existing king. You don't do that. Before the conversation was over, the messenger came in to Vespasian to tell him that in Rome they had appointed him to be the emperor of Rome. Now, the rule in Rome was that when the people that brought good tidings, good news, were rewarded, and people that brought bad news were punished, as if the messenger is the one that it's his fault. But that was their way, so that he felt that a sense of gratitude to Rabbi Yisroel. The Talmud tells us the story that Vespasian told him he can ask for 3 requests and he'll grant them. Now here's an interesting story that happens. It's hard to understand it. The Talmud asks the question. The 3 things that Rabbi Yisroel asked for are very hard to understand. The first thing he asked for was to save the family of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. To save the family of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. To spare them. Because in Rome they would have killed everyone. Because he was the leader of the Jews, the spiritual leader. So he asked for them to be spared. The second thing that he asked for, there was a great sage at the time, his name was Rab Tzadok. And Rab Tzadok knew that the destruction was coming, so he fasted for 40 years straight. He fasted every day and he ate at night. And obviously he became very sick. And he was an old man, he was in his 80s, maybe even older. And he was full, he needed medical attention. The second thing Rabbi Yisroel asked Vespasian was to provide the medical attention and medical needs of this Rab Tzadok. The third thing he asked was, the famous request was, Ten li Yavne v'chachameh. Give me Yavne and its sages. In other words, allow for us to set up shop in the southern city of Yavne. We'll build our yeshiva there, we'll leave Jerusalem, and let the sages be there. Rabbi Vespasian was probably inside. He was he was laughing at the old man that these are the requests that he asked for. But he was happy that those are relatively easy things to fulfill. And of course he fulfilled them. What he didn't realize that Rabbi Yisroel ben Zakkai was outsmarting the Roman emperor. Because it turns out that after the destruction of the temple, I'll get to that later. Now, the Talmud asks, why didn't he ask for something more significant? Why not ask for Jerusalem? Not to destroy Jerusalem, or for the temple. So there are 2 opinions. The Talmud Bavli says that he didn't believe. There's 2 answers given. That there was a mistake. And indeed, he made a mistake. The other answer is that he didn't believe that he would grant that. You don't ask for, it's too much to ask for. The Jerusalem Talmud is of the opinion that he actually did ask for that, but he was turned down. And that's when he turned to the lesser things that he asked for. And that indeed, he went to Yavna after the destruction. He went to Yavna, and many of the sages followed him. And they started the spiritual center of Yavna, back to Jerusalem. Once Aspasionis, meaning Vespasian, that's the Hebrew name for Vespasian is Aspasionis. In the Talmud, that's what he's called. Once he heard that he's a Roman emperor, he went back to Rome. And he left the army and the rest of the conquest of the land of Israel and Jerusalem to his son Titus. Now, one of the people that Titus used as a advisor was this Josephus. Now, in Josephus' books, he writes very positively about Titus. He says he wasn't such a bad person. He didn't even really want to destroy the temple. He kind of like paints him in a better picture than perhaps he deserved. But he was of the opinion that Titus didn't really want to destroy the temple. And that you'll see soon that finally when the temple was destroyed, he said that the whole thing was a mistake. It wasn't meant to be, that Titus didn't intend to destroy the temple. Now, Titus was advised by his advisors, Josephus and others, you don't work too hard. Don't break through the walls. Don't fight. The Jews are going to do it to themselves. They'll eat themselves up. They'll destroy themselves from within, and you'll be there. You'll be able to just later go in and pick up the pieces and do what you want. Sadly, that is what happened. Now, finally, in the month of Tammuz, the 9th day of Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, and we fast on the 17th of Tammuz, it was 3 weeks ago, Titus broke through the walls of Jerusalem finally, and they began to ransack the city, what we know today as the old city of Jerusalem, and he knew about the tragic day of the 9th of Av, because the first temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av. So he wanted to bring an end of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. He waited for the 9th of Av to kind of like blow it to them, like stick it to them on their day of mourning. But according to Josephus, Titus didn't intend to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. And you think about it, you can't even burn the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash was made out of stone. It was a fireproof building. So the truth is this, how do you build it? How do you destroy? How do you burn a building of stone? The truth is, when it did happen, it was miraculous that it actually caught on, that the thing came down. Our rabbis tell us that the miracle happened because in this way God poured out his anger at stones and bricks rather than the Jewish people. So he burnt the temple, but at least as a remnant he allowed the Jewish people to survive. So that's why Hashem destroyed the temple as a symbol that this is the way I'm going to allow my anger to be flared up, but you yourself will be saved. There will be a future for the Jewish people. What Josephus writes in his book is that a certain soldier flung a torch at in the temple. There were tapestries made out of fabric, beautiful ones that Herod had made, and he flung a torch at caught onto one of these tapestries, and that's what started the fire. He writes that they tried to extinguish the fire, but because of the siege that went on for so long, there was no water, they couldn't do it, and that's how when the whole temple caught on fire, and it just was burned. Now, the temple, the fire began in the late afternoon of the 9th of Tisha B'Av. And it burned through the whole night of the 10th and the whole day of the 10th. It says that the rabbis thought of making the 10th of Av as the day of mourning. The reason they made it on the 9th was because the 9th was already a national day of mourning because of the first temple. and other tragedies that happened. So they just left it to the 9th of Av, and the 10th of Av they left alone as not to have. Now, many thousands of Jews committed suicide, threw themselves into the fire. They said, the Jewish people are over. If the temple is dying, we're dying with the temple. And they went into the flames, into the temple. Many others didn't do that, but the Romans killed them. What's left of the temple after the fire was, the remnant was as we know today, the southern wall. I'm sorry, the western wall. The western wall is not of the temple itself. Many people don't know this. The western wall that we have today is not of the temple itself. It's of the wall that surrounded the Temple Mount, the temple compound, but not of the temple proper. But that's what we have left today from the temple. The Romans then lashed out. They ran and killed everyone. Wherever there was a Jewish presence, they went. They went even to Transjordan, to the other side. There was an enclave of Jews. They went in, they killed everyone. The last place that the Jews were able to put up a fight was under this famous Elazar ben Yair. They escaped with 1,000 other Jews, south to the Judean hills, and they climbed up the mountain of Masada. Now Masada was a fortress that Herod built 100 years earlier. And he built over there the magnificent. I mean, you still see today some of the murals and some of the mosaics. I mean, the thing is just. I mean, he up on a mountain over there. It's just his vacation home. You understand? That wasn't meant to be his permanent place where he lived. This is one of his vacation homes. So you can imagine how extravagant he was. He was larger than life. But they went there and they hid in Masada. The Romans found out about it, and you know the story. They came, they surrounded the mountain, they built a ramp, but the Jews were throwing stones at them from the top of the mountain. They were killing many Romans, until the Romans did what many others have done throughout history, and the Nazis also did it. They used the Jews. Like the Kapos, right? You use Jews against Jews. What they did was they used the Jews to build the ramp, and the Elazar ben Yair wasn't with his men up there, decided they're not going to throw stones and kill Jews. And that's how the Romans were able to finalize building the ramp, and they eventually got up there. Now what happened was, the other two generals, just parenthetically, Shimon ben Giora and Yochanan Gush Chalav, one of them escaped. They were both caught. One of them was assassinated. One of them was put into prison in Rome, and he died there in prison. And that was the end. Now the siege in Masada lasted for 3 years, believe it or not, till the year 73. Just imagine this. They're up on the mountain for 3 years. They had supplies and they had water. I mean, you see the areas where they were able to hold those unbelievable amounts of water. It was an incredible thing. But at the end, the Romans did get up there, and the Jews, under Elazar ben Yair, they decided that they're going to commit suicide rather than become slaves to Rome. And every father was given the job, unbelievable, to slaughter his own family. And they did that. And when the Romans came up the next morning, all they found was corpses. And I want to spend a minute or two or three on the issue of Masada. Today, Masada is seen as a place of Jewish heroism. Strong fighters, they didn't give in. And when you go up there and you watch the video, they present it as one of these heroic. But I want you to know that that was not the way the rabbis at the time, the Jewish leadership, the spiritual leadership of the Jewish people, felt that Elazar ben Yair had made a mistake. They saw no point in it. You can fight, it's a lost battle. What's this business? You don't kill yourself, you don't commit suicide, it's not the Jewish thing to do. And therefore, Masada did not have that magic that it has today. Today we see it as macho Jews. They fought like, a little bit like the, not to misunderstand me, but a little bit like there was also a lot of debate with regard to the ghetto, to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It wasn't so simple. Everyone today thinks it's a given that the Warsaw Ghetto was a heroic thing and it was unbelievable and they did a great thing and they fought, they killed Nazis, they did. But it wasn't so simple at the time. The Jews of the ghetto with the rabbis were very, very undecided. There was a lot of different opinions, and there's a lot of reason to believe that the traditional, the rabbinic leadership in the ghetto were against doing what they did. I'll leave that for others to decide. I'm not going to get into that now. So in the year 73, the ramp was finished. They took over Masada, and that was the end of that. Now Titus, because this war was such a difficult war, it was the most difficult war Rome ever fought. So when Titus came back to Rome, he organized a great march, a victory parade, and he built the Arch of Titus. I'm sure you've heard of the Arch of Titus if you didn't see it. And over there he carved into the arch the Jews, slaves that brought them all to Rome. And they were slaves. They brought different artifacts of the temple. They brought a certain menorah there. They brought the table. They brought other things. And that alone is a discussion. What happened to all these things? It's probably in the Vatican. But I'll leave that for a different discussion. Obviously, the destruction of the temple was an unbelievable shock to the Jewish people. And the Christians, we're talking now about the year 70. So Christianity is already in its beginning. And they saw that as a sign that they are right, that Christianity is the way to go. Because here you see that God didn't save the Jewish people, and they didn't, and the Torah should be changed now, and it should move on to them. The truth is that the Christians made almost zero inroads to the Jewish people during that time. Very little success, which led, of course, to the anti-Jewish sentiments that was prevalent in the church for so many hundreds and thousands of years till lately. By the end of the first century, Christianity was almost 100% not Jewish. In the beginning, it was all Jewish. It was all Jews. By the end of the first century, there was almost no Jews were in the Christian movement anymore. At that time, the Jews, a lot of them fled Israel, and they spread out. Those that were left, millions of Jews were left alive, and they spread out throughout the whole Roman Empire. And they very much succeeded. In Rome, by the way, within a number of years, once the Jews came there and were successful, they owned businesses. Shabbos became the day of rest in Rome, because so many of the businesses were run by Jews, and they were frum. They were religious Jews that didn't work on Shabbos, so the day of rest was on Shabbos. Later, when the Christians wanted to make Sunday the day of rest, it was passed as they didn't accept it because it was too many, 2 days of rest in a row. It was too much. Until of course today, you can't work more than 5 days a week, so 2 days of rest is not a problem. But in those days, it was either Sunday or Shabbos. So they chose Shabbos. That just tells you how influential the Jewish people were there in commerce and other such areas. Now, this brings me to the next two wars. I told you that we're going to go all the way till the time of Bar Kokhba. So this we'll do quick. 40 years after the destruction. Any questions? Fine. You're all sleeping with me. 40 years after the destruction, the Jews made an effort to rebuild the temple. And they tried to get permission. They tried to influence the The emperor of Rome at the time was a man by the name of Trajan. And he was willing to go along with it, but he made certain conditions that made it untenable. It was impossible for them. He said, build it somewhere else. You understand? To build the temple somewhere else, right? You know, he didn't understand why it had to be on that specific mountain. Obviously, the Jews weren't going to. It reminds me a little bit like 100 years ago when they said maybe we should go build. Herzl was ready to build the land to make the state of Israel in Uganda. He entertained such an idea. Until the other Zionists were a little more traditional, told him that ain't going to fly. No Jew is coming from Poland to Uganda. That's just not happening. But so they understood that wasn't going to happen, and because of the inability to build it, the Jews once again decided to go to war against Rome. In the year 110, there were two brothers that led the charge, that led the army, the two people by the name of Pappus and Lilianus. You ever heard of them? Pappus and Lilianus, they are quoted in the Talmud, famous two individuals, and they tried to get the Jewish to build a third commonwealth to re-establish the Jewish leadership in Israel. King and a ruler to be independence in the land of Israel. They were in the city of Lud. You know where Lud is? That's where the Ben Gurion airport is. And they gathered their army around them, and the Romans crushed it very quickly. They killed everyone, including Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel happened to be there then. He was also killed. And the Romans thought that with this, that ended the matter. Yeah, we crushed them quick. It was over, and that'll put a rest to the Jews' aspirations of independence. Trajan died, and he was succeeded by a man by the name of Hadrian. He became the new emperor of Rome. They tried to convince him also to allow them to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and to give them Jewish independence. So, and he believed that after what happened in Lud, with Pappus and Lilianus, they crushed it and it was over, he believed that they probably won't try such a stunt on him again, on Rome again. But he made a massive mistake. Because in about the year 130, the war of all wars against Rome began. And this turned out to be the worst war against Rome, and the last one. As you will see now, we will conclude with this chapter. Now, this war in 130, the year 130 after the Common Era, which was about 60 years after the destruction of the temple, a man by the name of Shimon ben Koziva, that's how he is known in the Talmud. He used to sign letters we have today, Yigal Yadin, when he did the archaeological digs in Israel, they found a lot of things from him. So they found signatures from Shimon ben Koziva. He's known as Bar Kokhba. You probably heard of Bar Kokhba. Shimon ben Koziva used to sign his name as Shimon ben Bar Koziba. Kof Vov Samach Yud Beis Hey. Later on, we'll wait till later on. We'll start first the story of this individual. Shimon bar Koziba was a mighty, strong man. He was tall, physically strong, almost like Samson. The tradition is that he was able to, when he was riding on his horse, he would be able to uproot a tree while he was passing on his horse. He'd wrap the tree around his head and uproot it. That's the strength that we're talking. So it's even if it's a legend that, it doesn't mean that they don't say that about me, right? There's no legend about me that I can uproot a tree while I'm riding. I can't even ride on a horse. get backaches and what do they call it? But that's the legend about him. Not only that, the legend has it that he gathered around him 200,000 troops. You know what 200,000 troops is? The tradition has it that he wanted to make it mandatory that in order to join his army, you had to be ready to cut off your small finger. The rabbis weren't going to have any part of that, obviously. That kind of mutilation was against Jewish law, so they didn't go with it. But he wanted to show it as a sign of, you're ready for this, you can fight. So the sign that he made was that you had to have the strength to uproot a tree. And he found 200,000 such soldiers. So however you want to understand it, a mighty fierce army he did have. He convinced Rabbi Akiva. See, till now, the first two wars, the war in 969, that 9-year war, and the war of Papasan, we'll be honest, the rabbis didn't agree with those wars. They held that it was a losing battle, you shouldn't do it. In this case, Bar Kokhba was able to convince Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, to go along with it. Once Rabbi Akiva went along with it, everyone went along with it. Rabbi Akiva's stature among the Jewish people was unprecedented. I mean, from Moses, it was like he was like the Moses. He was at it says in the Talmud that he was like at the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. So when he was convinced by Bar Kokhba to let this happen, he agreed. And he was this Bar Kokhba was a very, very charismatic person. He was a pious individual, a very, very religious man. And Bar Kokhba, he convinced Rabbi Akiva. He said the Romans were not going to be able to make any political gains with being Mr. Nice Guy. He said with them you have to go with force. And he began a rebellion that lasted 6 years. In the first 4 years of the rebellion, he was so successful that he drove Rome out of the city of Jerusalem. He reestablished the Jewish independence. Imagine this. And he had the intention to build the temple there. He was planning to build the Beis HaMikdash. Now what he did was, first he started a war in the north, in the Galilee, conquered them, pushed the Romans out, came all the way down to Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem, and he almost succeeded. He almost succeeded to reestablish everything. Rabbi Akiva even thought that he was the Mashiach. He entertained the idea that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva quoted about him the famous verse in the Bible, Dorach Kochav Miyakov, that Bilam said about the coming of the Mashiach. And that's how he got his name Bar Kokhba, because he was the Kochav. He was that star that was the shoot that came from Jacob to redeem the Jewish people. Rabbi Akiva considered him to be the Mashiach. And because he was so strong amongst the Jewish people, his influence was unbelievable, Rabbi Akiva. So a lot of the Jews, of course, went along with this for some time. You can imagine that the Christians would have no part of this. Christians didn't like the Romans either, but they had the idea that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach wasn't exactly going to be, they weren't going to go along with an idea like that, because that's one Mashiach too many, right? That's, so they weren't going to go with that. But he had about 350,000 troops. They were more than the Romans. The Romans didn't have 350,000 troops. And what Hadrian did was he summoned his entire army, came to Israel. From everywhere, from Syria, from everywhere. Now, as I mentioned, Bar Kokhba wanted to build a Beis HaMikdash, because what's one of the signs of Mashiach is that you build a Beis HaMikdash. And a lot of time he dedicated to this, which probably took him a while. At the end, he didn't start the project of the Beis HaMikdash. In the third year of the war, his influence and his power began to unravel. What happens with people that are so successful and become leaders is they begin to believe in themselves. And when that happens, he started believing that he's Mashiach. And he started with paranoia sets in, and this sets in. Before he knew it, he did certain things that the rabbis, Rabbi Akiva himself, began to be suspicious, began to realize maybe we're not so sure anymore. And little by little, he lost the support of the rabbis. And of course, once he died, they realized that he wasn't the Mashiach. Once he got killed in the army. Once he got killed, they realized that he wasn't the Mashiach. But what happened was, in the 4th year of the war, he began to lose. The Romans reorganized. He began to lose certain battles in different cities. And he believed that there were Jewish spies that were spying for Rome, and his paranoia set in. And he believed now he went against the rabbis because he realized that the rabbis had abandoned him. And he was beginning to lose the war. What happened was the Romans pushed him out of Jerusalem, and they pushed the Jews all the way to Beitar. Now Beitar is a famous city in the south of Jerusalem. Today we don't know exactly where it is, but there is a city Beitar today, of course. Whether it's in that exact location or near it is unimportant. But Beitar had 600,000 Jews gathered in Beitar, and there was the last stand of the Jews after 6 years. But the last stand was in Beitar, and believe it or not, Beitar fell on Tisha B'Av as well. That would happen today in the year 135, 135, 600,000 Jews were slaughtered by the Romans. And a great miracle happened, by the way. Bar Kokhba also fell in Beitar, together with another 500,000 to 600,000 Jews. Today we have, in the benching, the Birkat Hamazon, every day we say the 4th blessings, right? Baruch atah, after Uvnei Yerushalayim, we say the last blessing of the benching is the longest one. It begins with the words, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hatov v'hameitiv. The rabbis established this 4th blessing. It wasn't there before Beitar. They never had the 4th blessing. This 4th blessing of the grace after meals was instituted by the rabbis to thank Hashem for the miracle that happened in Beitar. What's the miracle? First of all, that the Romans let them bury them. They were there for a very long time. And you know that in July and August, in Israel, it's not, it's very hot. And after many, many days and weeks, they finally convinced the Romans to allow them to bury the dead. And they came to Beitar, and the miracle was that none of the bodies decayed. And that was the great miracle. They established this 4th blessing to thank Hashem for that miracle, which is such an interesting thing. Here, 600,000 Jews are dead, and the rabbis are thanking Hashem for the great miracle of allowing for their burial. That's the Jewish people. But, and here we come to the conclusion of this. Once this happened, finally Rome won this 60-year battle. Bar Kokhba was dead. Once Bar Kokhba was dead, the rabbis realized that he was false. So they changed his name from Bar Kokhba from Bar Kusiba, that he was his original name, to Bar Kuziva, who was a Zayin. The word Kuziva means kozov, means false. And that's the name he got because they didn't think that they realized that he wasn't the real Mashiach. Anyway, when Hadrian had realized what had happened, he said to himself, this is it. I'm done with the Jewish people forever. We're getting rid of them. He now dealt with the Jewish problem. The solution, what do they call it? The solution to the Jewish problem, right? He said, I had enough of them. Rome has been through 3 wars with them already. We're not having a 4th one. We're putting an end to this. How did he do this? He realized that the survival of the Jewish people is their Torah, is their religion, is their observance. So he now began to pass decrees against Jewish observance. famous decrees of Hadrian in Israel in the year 135 and on, Jews were not allowed to circumcise themselves. They were not allowed to learn Torah. They were not, and they, at the cost, he passed the decrees and warned that anyone that violates it will be killed and tortured to death the worst, horrendous way. And he lived up to his promise. The famous 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur in the service happens during this time. Amongst, of course, these 10 martyrs is none other than Rabbi Akiva himself. He was the 10th of the 10 martyrs. Where did they kill Rabbi Akiva? They killed him near the jail in Caesarea over there by the Hippodrome. If you haven't been to Caesarea, you see over there you have the Colosseum. Over there they killed many Jews as they made it like a sport. And they killed, the gladiators came there. They had the Hippodrome. So that's one right near the other. So they brought a sport, and they killed thousands and thousands of Jews there. And in that same compound, or whatever you call it, that same area, is the famous jail of it's right on the coastline over there. You see the building. And over there was where they tortured Rabbi Akiva and the 10 martyrs and so many other thousands of Jews. Now, he did another thing. He decided, I had enough of the Jewish dream of building another temple over here in Jerusalem. So what did he do? He went up on the mountain and he had them level the ground. He lowered the mountain by 300 meters. He dug it up, meaning he plowed it up. And he destroyed the mountain, not just the temple. He destroyed the mountain itself. That's why today when you go there, you see the mountain of Olives. It's much higher than the mountain where the temple was, where the wall is. The look at Mount Scopus is much higher. Har HaTzofim is much higher than the Har Moriah. It wasn't that way 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the Har Moriah, the Temple Mountain, was the highest of all the mountains. But he lowered it by 300 meters. Tzion, it says in the Eicha, we read it tonight, I believe. Tzion Soda Techoresh. He plowed it. That was a prophecy that Jeremiah said that the very mountain would be plowed under, would be plowed up. And that's what Hadrian did. He destroyed the mountain itself. Forget about the temple. Because he decided that was the end. He wasn't going to let the Jews have another shot at this. He exited. The Jews were driven out of Israel. And that brought an end to the Jewish presence as a significant presence in the land. The next 10 years were the worst years of persecution for Jews, and it looked like Judaism was coming to an end. Because without rabbis, without anything, there's nothing. Without the Jewish religion, we have nothing. What happened was Hadrian died. When Hadrian died, the next emperor of Rome happened to be a man that was a very, very noble person. His name was Antoninus, or Anthony, and he forged a great alliance with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the great sage Rabbi Yehuda, the prince. And this is the time that Jews were able to once again, under the leadership of the sages in Yavne, after Hadrian died and the Jewish persecution ended, Yavne then became very, very, very influential, and the Jewish religion, the Jewish people went from a political, it went from a nationalistic, if you want to call it that way, for lack of a better word, the emphasis now became on Torah, on religion, on study, on prayer. The temple was no longer this epicenter. It was now, we're talking about already 100 years, of 60, 70, 80 years after the temple. The shift went to the sages, Torah study, and in that sense is where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's genius was. He asked for Yavne and the sages because he realized he had outsmarted Vespasian, he had outsmarted Rome. He said, you can have Jerusalem for now. We'll go and build up the Jewish people with Torah and with scholarship, and that's exactly what they did. During this time, they redacted the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written in the year 190. which led to the study of all the yeshivas that produced the Talmud, and the rest is history. But that's the sad chapter of Jewish history known as the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, which we mourn tonight and tomorrow. 2 million Jews, by the lowest accounts, got killed during this era, during these wars, and that was even a greater blow than any other blow that we have had up till the Holocaust. Some even say, this debates if there were really 10 million Jews at that time, but it could be that in proportion even more of a blow was dealt to us then than now. Regarding Josephus, I just want to mention that even when he went to Rome, he remained a frum Jew, he remained a religious Jew. It's not like he left Judaism. He believed that he was a hero. He believed that once he went to Rome, he was influential to reduce the level of the animosity. And in his own mind, he thought that he did the right thing. So the jury is out on that one. I'll let you all decide. I'll let others. We're not going to come to a conclusion on that. But his books are very authoritative. The Rashi quotes him all the time. And Josephus is a tremendous value. I mean, he wrote extensive history of the Jewish people from the beginning till his time. And we learned a lot from his books. So that you can't take away from him, certainly. But that concludes the story of the temple's destruction and the aftermath of that destruction. And today, the world, Rome is we do see ruins of Rome, and we see the aqueduct, and we have the remains of the Hippodrome, at least the outline of the Hippodrome. We have the outline of the Colosseums. But for the most part, Rome is a bygone. They're not very influential in the world today at all. The original Romans aren't even the current Romans. It's a different nation. The Jewish people are still learning about Rabbi Akiva every day. There's thousands and thousands of children in schools that are not only learning Rabbi Akiva's teachings, but are actually living according to his halachas. And the Jewish people, through these great sages who had the wisdom to shift the focus away from the central temple centrality, which they knew was coming to an end. It just couldn't fight it. They had a prophetic vision also, probably they had some divine knowledge about that too. But with their little request, Gimme Yavna and the sages, you and I are sitting here tonight talking about it. Because had he not made that request, had he continued to try to maneuver the situation in Jerusalem, maybe we would have had another few years there. And without the great sage, the great academies of learning, and without the great books that came as a result of it, in the last 2,000 years, there's no doubt that Judaism would have ended very, very long ago. But Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people are here forever. God is here forever. We are a part of God's reality, therefore we will be here forever. Rome is in Wikipedia, maybe in good books, but we are here still alive and well. But we do have to fast, and we have to mourn this destruction because it costed us a tremendous, took a toll. And the truth of the spiritual great revelation of godliness that was present in the temple, of course we don't have today. So may it be the will of God that we should, these days should be turned from days of mourning to days of joy, and we should once again be reunited with the great kings of Israel, with David, with Solomon, with Rabbi Akiva, and all the great sages that followed him, all the way till our time, with the coming of Mashiach. May it happen speedily in our days. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for being so patient.